This integrity session is for a brief introduction to the lymphatic system. Primarily focuses on the anatomy of the system, including the T cells, B cells. Also looks at the lymph nodes and lymphatic organs. The primary objectives are these six. What is the physiology of the lymphatics? What is the anatomy of the lymphatics, including that of the spleen, the thymus, the tonsils, and adenoids? And again, what are the physiological functions of the lymph nodes and the lymph vessels? The lymphatic system is really a backup system for the circulatory system. Whereas in the circulatory system we have veins, capillaries, and arteries. Much of the plasma that leaves those vessels returns back to the capillaries. About 10%, however, stays in the tissue. For example, when oxygen exchanges from the capillaries to enter the tissue, it does not leave the capillary bed in a gas form. It leaves it suspended in plasma or liquid from the blood. Much of this liquid returns to the capillaries at its most distal end, but about 10% of it stays in the tissue. If this plasma were to remain in the tissue, we would have edema. And so this backup system, the lymphatics, slowly absorbs the rest of this plasma into lymphatic capillaries. As it goes up into the lymphatic system, at certain points along the way, there are lymph nodes which filter this liquid and actually traps things such as viruses, fungi, and other debris. When it passes through the other side of the lymph node, this lymph, which is clear liquid, is now filtered. At 2 points in the body, the right and left lymphatic duct, the lymph capillaries join together, and this lymph plasma is recirculated into the blood supply in the subclavian vein. This is a picture of the lymph organs, and you can see the tonsils, adenoids. These things are mostly located at those entry levels to the body, so that where bacteria could enter the body through the mouth, we have the tonsils and adenoids and other lymph nodes which will filter that air or that food. We look down near the groin. Again, we have those vaginal and penile openings and the anal openings. And so in order to catch any antigens that would enter in these regions, we have the groin lymph nodes. Again, when blood flows through the cardiovascular capillary beds, it does not release nutrients or oxygen, or actually even engage the carbon dioxide waste in its original form. All of these nutrients and substances are dissolved in plasma or liquid from the blood. Most of the liquid returns to the capillaries, but some of it does not. About 10% stays trapped in the tissue. Again, the purpose of the lymphatic system. Now, lymph itself is a clear fluid, and it mostly does resemble plasma. It's got, however, extra substances such as electrolytes, waste from metabolizing cells, so you might see some ammonia, carbon dioxide. Lymph is rich in protein, and depending on the lymph, most of it again is clear. The lymphatic systems also help in absorbing fat from the intestine. This is not clear. This is white, and it's called chyle. Not to be confused with the chyme, which is the digested food as it leaves the stomach and enters the small intestine. We're probably all familiar with the word lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are those white blood cells that help us to fight infection, and thus another function of the lymphatic system is to assist in immune responses. Again, these are the primary organs of the lymphatic system. Lymphocytes are made in the bone marrow, as are most blood cells. However, once made in the bone marrow, lymphocytes, some travel to the thymus gland to develop or to mature. Those lymphocytes are called T cells. Other lymphocytes develop and mature in the bone marrow, and they're called B cells, and we will discuss them later. So the bone marrow. The bone marrow is that spongy center of the bones. Here it says where white blood cells are made, but we know that red blood cells are also made there. Lymph vessels, again, unlike the circulatory system, the vessels of the lymphatic system are all capillaries. Like the veins, though, they do have valves to keep them flowing in one direction. The valves are, again, keep them flowing, but like the veins also, the skeletal muscles of the organs and the limbs propel the lymph up towards those lymphatic ducts. So we have lymph vessels in all parts of the body except the central nervous system, which is primarily the brain and the spinal cord. Lymph vessels are also missing from bone, cartilage, and teeth. The lymph node, we said, was a knot of tissue that is located along the lymph capillary route, and the purpose of the lymph nodes is to swell up and trap any foreign material that is in the lymph. Lymph nodes, again, are found near major arteries, but primarily, remember, they're found near those entryways where organisms or antigens, rather, can enter the body. So we primarily see most collection of lymph nodes near the groin and the neck. When we think about breast cancer or breast tissue, we also think of those axillary lymph nodes. All right. We said that as the lymph, which is propelled by skeletal muscle contraction, travels throughout the lymphatic system, as it goes through those lymph nodes to be purified and exits on the other side of the lymph nodes, they all come together in two large ducts. One is the thoracic duct, and the other is the right lymphatic duct. I think there is a picture later in the PowerPoint which kind of shows the location of the thoracic duct and the right lymphatic duct. Remember that these two ducts empty into the subclavian vein, and now that lymph has returned to the circulatory system and enters the heart as part of the plasma and blood cells. As we learn a lot in adult health, that whenever a surgeon suspects that a patient has become infiltrated with cancer cells, they also want to check the lymph nodes, because the lymph capillaries, in addition to carrying lymph, also carry debris that's trapped in the cell, viruses that are trapped in the cells, and also cancer cells. many of these cancer cells are trapped in the lymph nodes. So when we are staging or diagnosing the extent of metastatic cancer, want to look at, and actually during surgery, dissect those lymph nodes. And if those lymph nodes are clear, we know that there's very little spread. If the lymph nodes are infiltrated with metastatic cancer, usually that's going to be a poor prognosis. It's probably going to be more stage 3, stage 4 cancer. Again, some of the lymph organs are the tonsils. There are 3 types of tonsils, and I'll just leave you to read these. Remember that we used to excise the tonsils and adenoids whenever a child complained of swelling. Now we know that that's a major function of the lymphatic organ. So these indeed are lymph nodes, and when they swell, they're actually trapping some of the bacteria from the pharynx. Lymph nodes such as the tonsils and adenoids are only excised now when they become so painful or so large that the child or the person cannot eat. So again, tonsils do shrink, but they never completely disappear. They are again vital immune fighting, our immune parts of the immune system, which help us to fight infection. Okay, adenoids again are parts of the tonsil system. The liver is usually called a lymphatic organ. Most of us as nurses know that the liver is a vital organ in removing toxins from the body. But many of the antigens that are found in our food supply, remember, as the food nutrients are absorbed through the small intestine, they first take that those nutrients in the blood to the liver in order to cleanse the new nutrients that are now been introduced into the circulatory system before they reach the heart. So remember that those nutrients diffuse into the villi, into the small intestinal lining. Now it's become a part of those mesenteric capillaries. Those capillaries then first transport this blood into the liver. Again, the liver acting as a lymph node filters this blood. The spleen is also considered a lymphoid organ. Many times we think of it in terms of digestion, but remember that the spleen is a major part of fighting infection, in that it gets enlarged, and we can probably only palpate it when we're fighting an infection. The spleen is on the left side of the abdomen, and again, doesn't really filter lymph, but it filters blood. So if there are organisms in the blood, the spleen swells up and traps those organisms and kills them. This is really a more detailed description of how the spleen acts as a lymphatic organ. Remember, it doesn't really filter lymph, it filters blood, but as the blood comes into the spleen, those microorganisms are trapped and killed by leukocytes that reside in the spleen. The cleansed blood then goes through the spleen and into the splenic vein. Remember, sometimes in sickle cell, the spleen is removed, or because the spleen is so vascular, if a person has a motor vehicle accident or some other injury to the spleen, it may be removed. These people now are more at risk for infection because they've lost a vital lymphatic organ. These are other things about the spleen. Primarily, again, understanding, we're going to talk a little bit later about antigens and antibody reactions. Okay, Peyer's patches, not really want to talk a lot about these, but these are lymph nodes that are found in the intestinal wall. The thymus. The thymus is a major lymphatic organ. Again, we said that lymphocytes are actually made in the bone marrow, but that some of these lymphocytes travel to the thymus in order to mature, and these are called T cells. The thymus is located just below the sternum, so in the upper chest. As we are growing, I guess, from 1 to about puberty, our thymus is its most active, and it's the most, at that time, it's the largest in size that it'll be. As we reach about 20, the thymus starts to shut down, and so that by the time we're 65, it is atrophied so much that it is dysfunctional. This is one of the reasons that we say that the elderly are immunocompromised, because we've learned of the importance of those T cells that are maturing in the thymus. Once the thymus shuts down, no more T cells are going to be made. Again, this talks about the development of those T cells. So in the fetus, those stem cells are in the bone marrow become lymphocytes. Many of them travel to the thymus where they become T cells. Mature T cells are then released into the blood. And again, because the thymus shuts down about right after puberty, all the T cells that we're ever going to make have already been made. Again, remember that it continues to shrink and atrophy, so that as we reach 65, probably no thymus is left. T cells, once they leave the thymus, may reside in the lymph nodes, and we said that the lymph nodes were those knots of tissue that trap bacteria, fungi, viruses, and swell. And the T cells or lymphocytes that reside in the lymph nodes actually phagocytize and kill those antigens. Again, T cells are made in the bone marrow, mature in the thymus gland, and then are released into the blood. There are two major types of T cells, and now we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the immune function of the lymphatic system. So the major types of T cells are T killer cells, and they're sometimes called cytotoxic cells, also T helper cells. So the cytotoxic cells or T killer cells are sometimes called CD8 cells. This is just a taxonomy to differentiate the different types of T lymphocytes. Killer cells are named so because they actually phagocytize antigens. Helper cells are further called CD4 cells, again because of the taxonomy of their protein. Helper cells are those cells that actually start the whole immune response. Those persons who are diagnosed with HIV or have developed AIDS, which is acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, lack helper cells. What we're going to learn is that when HIV, that virus, enters the body, remember viruses cannot reproduce on their own, and so they enter a host, take over the mechanism and the reproductive mechanism of that host, and when the host divides, the viruses are reproduced. The HIV virus only likes to take up residence in the host, which is the T helper cells. So again, think about it. The thymus cell, the thymus gland, has stopped producing more T cells after we reach puberty. So we have a limited number of T cells, T helper cells in our body. if HIV enters our body and takes over the mechanism of the T helper cells, then our finite number of T cells will dwindle because they will no longer function as T helper cells. Indeed, they become HIV factories. So this is probably the most significant slide in the whole presentation. It summarizes the immune response. So, an antigen, remember an antigen is anything that's foreign that enters the body. It doesn't have to be biological. It can be glass or some kind of fungus. It can be anything. So an antigen invades the body, and the only way that the rest of the body knows that it's been invaded are these T helper cells come up and actually engage the antigen. We've since learned that there are Langerhans cells that actually do alert the T helper. So antigen enters the body, these Langerhans cells alert the T cells that the body's been invaded. The helper Ts then release proteins that will do several things. First, it will make clones of the T cells itself. So the helper cell sort of raises the alarm, and in raising the alarm, it starts the production of other types of T cells. We know that there are at least 4 types of T cells, and each has a specific function. So the helper cell meets the antigen, and in its way, it reproduces something similar to the antigen in the form of T helper cells, also makes T killer cells, remember those cytotoxic cells, it makes T memory cells and T suppressor cells. Okay, so again, helper cells come up and meet the antigen, and in copying its structure, clones into 4 types of T cells: T helpers, T killers, T memory, and T suppressors. In addition to making these 4 clones, the T helper cells alert the B lymphocytes. Remember, those are the lymphocytes that mature in the bone marrow. And the B lymphocytes start the production of antibodies that really look like the antigen. Remember, antibodies are very specific. They only can deactivate a specific antigen. So if we build antibodies to hepatitis B, they will look a lot like the hepatitis B virus, and they will be helpful in suppressing the growth of hepatitis B in our body. So we're going to talk about what each one of these different types of cells do. Okay, so let's just talk first about the T helper cells. So T helper cells, we said, were very vital in even ringing the alarm. And so if a person has HIV, they have a very, very small number or dwindling numbers of T cells every time the HIV cell reproduces. It takes over more helper cells. So remember, we're not making any more. So at some point when we reach below 200, the person is said to be no longer HIV positive, but now is in full-blown AIDS. So the helper cells raise the alarm, I've been invaded. They also start those cloning of more T helper cells and the killer cells. Now the killer cells go out and immediately start to phagocytize these antigens. Then we know that they're not going to be successful in killing all of the antigens, but they will help to keep the numbers down. Killer cells actually are usually engulfed in this process, and so they don't last very long. Most of our killer cells are going to be eradicated as they're trying to phagocytize the antigen. Once the helper cells, though, have alerted the production of B cells, the B cells start to produce antibodies. This is going to be our long-term, most effective defense against the antigen. And so maybe our antibodies may take about a week to be properly developed, but once the antibodies are made, they go out also and engage the antigen. And remember, they bind with the antigen, which makes it bigger and slower and makes it a ready target for those killer cells. So now we have the killer cells phagocytizing the antigen and the antibodies attaching and slowing them down, and so that over time we should be able to actively engage and kill most antigens. We know that some viruses become dormant, so we can't really kill all of them, but maybe we can keep their numbers down to prevent us from having full-blown disease. Once the antigen has been stopped, those suppressor cells, remember the clones, one of those 4 clones was the suppressor cells. The suppressor cells stop the killer cells and the antibodies from warring. Alright, so again, they just stop the production of more T and B cells because indeed we've actually eradicated the antigen. The important thing though is now we have memory T cells, a part of those clones, so that the antigen ever invades again, we don't have to go so slowly to have a week to build up those antibodies. Antibody production can start immediately. This is the production or the process that we try to emulate when we vaccinate a person. So remember, when we give someone a vaccination, we usually give them either a killed or a modified form that looks like this antigen. Again, fools the body, and so that the helper cells engage this vaccine, go out and recognize it, starts the clones of those killer T cells, helper T cells, memory cells, and suppressors, also starts antibody production with the stimulation of this B cell. So that again, we've had the vaccination, we now have understanding, our body knows how to make those antibodies. So the time that we actually do engage the real substance, for instance, if we're getting a vaccination against hepatitis B, if we ever do engage the hepatitis B virus, those memory T cells are already there and they start immediate production of the hepatitis B antibodies. Okay, this talks a little bit about HIV. So again, remember, because the HIV virus cannot reproduce on its own, it takes up host in those CD4, which are the T helper cells. As the disease progresses, it progresses because HIV is reproducing. Every time it reproduces, just takes over another of those T helper functions, right? So at some point, we have so few T helper cells that if we get invaded by even a common cold virus, we can't mount a response because there's no T helper cells to start that whole clone reproduction. This gives us a lot more information about HIV, and this would be helpful for those in adult health who are trying to understand HIV and the lymphatic system. So HIV, remember, it binds to the CD4. CD4 is another name for the T helpers, and again, the HIV loves only the T helper cells, and it uses it as its host. And in this way, it takes over T helper function and makes those T cells into HIV factories. An early HIV immune system, remember, there's still some T helpers that are not invaded by the HIV, and so we can still have some immune response. Over time, though, those T helper cell numbers are going to fall, primarily because, remember, the thymus has atrophied and it's no longer making more T cells. The T cells that we already had are becoming infected with HIV. This is a glossary those cells that are made by the thymus. So again, the killer T cells, which are also called cytotoxic cells, destroy antigens by punching holes in the cell membrane, and they also create these cytokines, which are just poisons, right, that punch, again, destroy the antigen. The helper T cells are those cells, those CD4 cells, that mount the response, right? They call the alarm, call into production those 4 types of T cells: helpers, killers, memory suppression. They also stimulate B cell production. And remember, those B cells are the cells that stimulate antibody production. Suppressor T cells are part of that clone quadriceps, I guess. We got 4. But remember, the suppressor cells come into being when the antigen has been destroyed, and they stop the immune response. Those memory cells are round, so if we get reinfected by those antigen, it can speed up the response. Okay, hope that this has been helpful in understanding the lymphatic system, and also in understanding why HIV is such a devastating disease, because if we do not mount a response to any antigen, then we're going to be infected by that antigen. And again, because we have no immune response, and when we get to full-blown AIDS, someone can die from an opportunistic disease that the average uninfected person can fight without a real struggle. So, hope this has been helpful, and thank you.